And she'll introduce herself. She wants to talk about the crime bill and how it's going to affect First Nations, and then I will carry on and introduce you to who you're all anxiously waiting to hear from. And take it away, Courtney.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Sue, for the introduction. I'm just going to read off of here, so if I tend to be looking down a lot, it's because I haven't memorized this. I kind of just came up with it. But anyway, I'm here to discuss the negative implications that Bill C-10 will have on the Indigenous people of this country and its youth. I'm a youth representative for PPKC's First Nations Justice Committee, and I have found that this particular bill will be imperatively harmful for Aboriginal youth. National Chief Sean Atleo has pointed out that Aboriginal youth are more likely to be incarcerated than to graduate from high school. With that being said, it also costs more to incarcerate someone than to put them through education. Aboriginals in Canada make up 3 to 4% of the population, yet at the provincial levels, incarcerated inmates are tenfold that number. In Saskatchewan, 87% of incarcerated inmates are Aboriginal. In Manitoba, 83%, and in Alberta, 54% are Aboriginal. These numbers are reprehensible, and surely the government had considered this in the proposal of this bill. The discriminatory treatment of Aboriginals in the justice system is recorded in more than 30 reports in over a decade. The notion that Aboriginal people's history of colonization, residential schools, and intergenerational poverty should be taken into account in sentencing. This notion became a part of Canadian law after a 1999 Supreme Court decision, allowing judges to hand out less severe sentences based on an Aboriginal defendant's personal history and allow them to enter rehabilitation programs based in Aboriginal culture. After this bill becomes law, those tools will no longer be there. In some of those cases, and individuals will go to jail, and the programs that try to deal with the addiction problems will not be made readily available to the incarcerated Aboriginal population. Pamela Thames, a woman who works for Unlocking Aboriginal Justice Society in Vancouver, expressed great distress at an AFN National Justice Forum when the discussion of this bill came about. She has stated that by April, the entire organization that she works for will be shut down because of this bill. An organization that has dedicated the last 12 years to alternative measures for Aboriginal youth and has been highly productive in that time. It seems unfair to me that these women will lose their job and all of the hard work and dedication put forth into helping Aboriginals facing incarceration. Not only has the crime rate in Canada been declining since 1973, but it has been proven that alternative measure programs and organizations such as these work. They have contributed to the declining crime rate we have and have been helping with the support needed by Aboriginal people. Canada does not have a crime problem, nor do we need more jails. So I'm standing here today to ask you to stand for proper justice and to support common sense. Not only for me or my people, but for women such as Pamela Thames who dedicate their lives to helping Aboriginal youth. Thank you. Thank you. Also, we have a petition against this bill, and I'm going to leave it in the back for some of you to sign it if you want to support my cause. Thanks. Oh, I don't have it with me right now, so I need to go get it and then bring it. But
we'll send it through the audience.
Okay.
Thanks, Courtney.
Thank you, Courtney. And this brings us, and it starts what we're going to do tonight. One of the main things that I love doing is connecting dots. And when you connect dots, you start to realize the struggles of all peoples, and you start to realize the common threads of oppression, and you begin to realize the common threads of liberation. And so, what Courtney's talking about is happening here, it's happening today, it's happened historically to Aboriginal people. And we have Mike Krebs with us, who is First Nations, who is involved with the liberation of our peoples and with the peoples of Palestine. And I'm not going to talk too much because I'm not going to steal his thunder. But it touches my heart to see another brother that's standing up like this, because we need to connect the dots. In the end, we're all children of Mother Earth. And as children of Mother Earth, the honor of one is the honor of all. And so I will let Mike carry on that way, because I did some Googling and I can see that he's much in line with what I've said. So take it away, Mike, and we're very honored to have you here.
If people are okay, I'm going to sit. But if my voice isn't projected to the back, just tell me and I'll either speak up or stand up. Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out, and also thank especially the organizers for bringing me out here to speak for Regina's Israeli Apartheid Week. And also I want to start also by acknowledging the lands that we're on, the traditional territory of, it's my understanding this is traditionally Cree territory. If I'm wrong in that, please feel free to correct me. So yeah, I've never been here to speak before or anything, so just quickly, as was mentioned, my name is Mike Krebs, and I live in Vancouver. I grew up there. It's the traditional Coast Salish territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. My background is Blackfoot. My family's from southern Alberta. And yeah, for a number of years, in addition to being involved in different struggles, Indigenous struggles of our people, and in solidarity with like struggles of other Indigenous people of Turtle Island, I've also done a lot of solidarity work on Palestine. It's something that I grew up with from an early age, with my family sort of having this just sort of implicit understanding of the similarities of what has happened and what continues to happen to us here as Indigenous people, and what has happened to Palestinians and continues to happen to Palestinians. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Basically the similarities between Canada and Israel, why there's such a close relationship between Canada and Israel, and what the implications are for doing work within Canada in support of the Palestinian struggle, and in building campaigns for boycott, divestment, sanctions. So this is part of the program for Israeli Apartheid Week here. One of the main purposes of Israeli Apartheid Week, when it was started in Canada, was a means to respond to the call that came out from Palestinian civil society in 2005 for people of conscience around the world to launch campaigns for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, targeting the state of Israel until it complies with international law, which entails, amongst other things, ending its policies of apartheid and occupation against Palestinian people. And this, the basis of the 2005 call, obviously it's based on a concrete analysis of Israel as an apartheid state, and this is based on the definitions of international law. It's not just because Israel happens to be similar to South Africa. It's not just like a comparison or an analogy. But clearly, when this call was launched, it drew a lot of inspiration from the struggle in South Africa against apartheid. And it also drew against the tools used of solidarity work in the form of taking on the strategy and tactics of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So I think it's important internationally to draw influence and inspiration from the experience of the struggle against South African apartheid. But I think in the context of doing that solidarity work in Canada, you also need to make another set of connections and understand the similarities. And again, it's the similarity of the history of Israel's colonization of the Indigenous people of Palestine and Canada's colonization of Indigenous people here. And I think it's important to acknowledge too, what I'm saying, like this comparison or this connection, it's not something that's particularly new. I know of examples, at least since the 1970s, where Palestinians and Indigenous people of Turtle Island made this connection. One example was in the 70s, there was a joint statement signed by the American Indian Movement and the Palestine Liberation Organization, where they declared formal solidarity, and to quote, they declared a united resistance to a common form of oppression. And in Vancouver, you'll notice a lot of the examples I give are from Vancouver, since this is where I've lived my whole life. So that's that's the context that I know. But in Vancouver as well, at least since the 1970s, there's a whole history of Palestinians and Indigenous people in the Vancouver area working together on that same basis of making that connection. So the first thing I think we need to outline is to make it clear, if people don't already know, that the Canadian government is a strong supporter of Israel. To dig around on the Government of Canada's website and the Department of Foreign Relations page, they have a section strictly on Canada-Israel relations, and I just want to start with a bit of a quote from that. So this is off the Canadian government's website. Canada and Israel have strong multidimensional bilateral relations marked by close political, economic, social, and cultural ties. Support for Israel, especially its right to live in peace and security with its neighbors, has been at the core of Canada's Middle East policy since 1948. The relationship has been strengthened in recent years, as evidenced by the increased cooperation in several areas, including public security, defense, trade, and investment, and the increased frequency of ministerial visits. Canada and Israel marked 60 years of diplomatic relations on May 11, 2009. On this occasion, Prime Minister Stephen Harper stated, "At the heart of relations between Canada and Israel is the dynamism of our shared communities. We look forward to the next 60 years and beyond." So just to break down what this means in practice, one of the major ways that Canada's in recent years has shown its support for Israel, and I'll come back to this a bit later, is on the international stage, as an uncritical defender of Israel's multiple violations of international law and war crimes. And this support has increased significantly in the last 5 years. In 2006, Canada was the first country, aside from Israel, to cut all aid to the Palestinian Authority after the elections of Hamas in the Palestinian Legislative Council. In the same year, in 2006, during the war on Lebanon by Israel, during which thousands of people were killed in just a matter of weeks, Stephen Harper described Israel's actions as a, quote, just and measured response. In 2009, during Operation Cast Lead, often called the Gaza War, but looking at what actually happened, there wasn't really much of a war. This was a massacre. An estimated 1,400 Palestinians were murdered in a matter of weeks. I believe it was between 300 and 400 estimated of that were children. And Canada completely supported this operation by Israel and was the only country to vote against a UN Human Rights Council resolution trying to condemn the attack. And the examples in the last couple of years, there's many. And this is just Canada's support for Israel on the international level. Within Canada, the Canadian government has actively participated in attempts to silence criticism of Israel, especially in the last few years as a response to the growing influence of the BDS campaigns in different areas across Canada. These attempts to silence criticism of Israel include 2009 defunding of Kairos Canada, the Canadian Arab Federation, for, in some cases, completely fictional perceptions that these organizations were supporting Palestine. Supporting the campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Kairos Canada lost its money being confused with a totally separate organization called Kairos Palestine. And just recently, the Palestine House in Mississauga had part of its funding cut for immigrant refugee services. And just to point out, in all three cases, it was very clearly stated by Jason Kenney that that was the impetus behind the cuts to this funding. There was also the exclusion of a UK politician and longtime anti-war activist, George Galloway, in 2009. That was eventually reversed. Another method of this was the founding of the Parliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism in 2009. And this is not just a thing going on in Canada, but it's part of a global project to criminalize criticism of Israel and counter the success of BDS in exposing Israel's crimes against Palestinians. And in this past summer, the CPCCA released its final report. And in this report, it recommended a number of things that Canada do to help stem this tide of criticism of Israel. The first was that it engaged the international community within various UN institutions to reduce criticisms directed against the State of Israel, which, as I mentioned, it's already doing. Cut funding to human rights organizations which are critical of the State of Israel, which again it's also doing. And finally, curtail immigration from African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian countries deemed too critical of the State of Israel. A third example of Canada's relationship with Israel is in the form of trade. 1997 was when the Canada Free Trade Israel Agreement came into effect. And since 1997, trade between Canada and Israel has tripled. There's also a public safety partnership program with Israel that was launched in March 2008. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So these are just some of the examples. Again, it's not like, it's very, very public knowledge that the current Canadian government is a devout, staunch supporter of Israel. But I think for us in the work that we're doing, what's important to understand in this is why, and why this relationship exists. And yes, and there's definitely been a turn in terms of the level of support and the way that it's expressed by the current government. But it can't be reduced to strictly the current conservative government or its policies. The relationship, the support from Canada for Israel predates the existence of Israel itself. Two prominent Canadians, Lester B. Pearson, before he was the Prime Minister of Canada, and Supreme Court of Justice Ivan Rand were both involved in pushing the UN to adopt the 1947 plan for the partition of Palestine. So again, this support from Canada for Israel goes back a long way. So I think, what I'm talking about today in terms of the similarities in Canada and Israel is only, I'm not going to say that it's the whole story, but I think it's a really critical factor in understanding this relationship that needs more attention. I think this is kind of an ongoing discussion within different cities and areas in Canada, this discussion of like why is Canada doing what it's doing towards Israel. And so for me, a big piece that we have to understand is the fact that both Canada and Israel are colonial settler countries with similar histories and a similar nature. And as a result, both Canada and Israel have very similar interests, especially in the realm of international politics. What it means for them to be colonial settler countries is that they're both founded on the colonization, theft, displacement, and dispossession of Indigenous people. And as a result of this, the impoverishment of Indigenous people in these lands. I'm talking Indigenous people here and Indigenous people of Palestine. So I think this history is crucial to understanding Canada's support for Israel. So what I want to do is I want to compare the processes, like somewhat historically, of colonization in Canada and in Palestine. And this isn't intended as like a history of Canadian colonialism or Israeli colonialism. I'm just providing some examples to show the similarities. And because Canada's colonial project started significantly sooner than Israel's, I think in one way I kind of see that Canada, one of the biggest contributions or gifts or shows of support for Israel that it's provided is a playbook by its example. The history of Canada serves as a real-life how-to guide for how to establish and maintain a settler society. different tactics, strategies, programs for how to take land, subjugate the indigenous population, weaken their resistance. You know, and so I want to illustrate how Israel has provided these examples. And again, they're really general. It doesn't do the justice to the challenges or the real damage done to Indigenous people by Canadian colonialism. First example, of course, is the Indian Act of 1876. And I think one of the ways to look at the Indian Act of 1876 is really the centerpiece of Canada's own version of apartheid. The Indian Act is a detailed policy to enshrine completely unequal rights, relations, and over time extremely disparate living conditions between Indigenous people and Canadian settlers. The Indian Act was part of a policy of extermination through the partial assimilation and separation of Indigenous people. The Indian Act also included the means by which to define who is and who is not Indian, based on the Canadian government's definitions through status. And then the process of developing and defining Indian status is also important to understand as a very gendered process. In that very different standards for attaining status were applied to Indigenous women versus men. And this had the effect of in that vast numbers of Indigenous women and their descendants lost not only their status as defined by the Canadian government, but their ability to remain in their communities or in the reserves. Which leads me to talking about reserves. The reserve system in Canada was a key aspect to the displacement of Indigenous people from our lands, followed by the theft of our land and all of its possible resources. And setting this up was a policy of containment. I should mention too that the process of colonizing Indigenous land isn't something that just happened in the past, it's one that continues. In a number of ways, but one example I'll give though is BC. People aren't familiar with it. Here, as well as the lands where my family's from, we're under a treaty. In our case of Blackfoot, it's Treaty 7. To me, this means that the government has a piece of paper they can point to say that they expropriated land fair and square. For the vast majority of the whole province of British Columbia, they don't have that. There are no treaties. The land has been acknowledged by both federal and provincial governments to be unceded territories. So while there is a very problematic process to try and establish modern-day treaties in these areas, that colonial process continues, and the extraction of resources from those lands continues. So in terms of how the reserve system and the whole strategy of containment relates to Palestine, sorry, this is, I don't know if people can see this map very well. I think it could be passed around. But it's basically, this is a map of, it's a historical map showing the gradual theft and occupation of Palestinian lands by the state of Israel. And a lot of people I know, when they're first learning about the history of Palestine, when they see this map, they're like, okay, wow, like this really tells the whole story for me. When I first saw this map, like it just the parallels were just so stark in terms of the history of Canada and the colonization of our territories. So similarly to the process in Canada, Israel's process of colonizing Palestine began with gradual Zionist settlement, beginning in earnest during the first decades of the 20th century. And it's a process that culminated in 1948 with the Nakba, which is the Arabic word for catastrophe. This saw the displacement of over 750,000 Palestinians from what then became the State of Israel on roughly 78% of historic Palestine. And as the map shows, this process of land theft deepened after the 1967 occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, with the expansion of Jewish-only settlements in the occupied territories, a process that continues to the present. It's also worth mentioning that the process of displacement of Palestinians from their homes and lands also continues within the borders of Israel, in East Jerusalem, and also in the Nakab Desert of the south, in regards to Bedouin Palestinians being continuously evicted from their lands. Another Another tool of Canadian colonization, historically, was the pass system evicted from their lands. Another tool of Canadian colonization, historically, was the pass system. The pass system was something that was instituted in 1885, and what this was it was a permit system that required Indigenous people permission to leave their reserve. They needed permission from the Indian agent, giving reasons why they were leaving, how long they were going away for, and the purposes of the trip. Under the pass system, Indigenous people needed this permit to leave, whether they were, if they were just traveling from one reservation to another, and even for the purposes of going to work on a farm of a white settler. You needed permission to leave. As I said, this was instituted in 1885, which was the same year as the Northwest Rebellion. And the pass system was justified in the context of that rebellion as a means to monitor Indigenous people, limit support for the rebellion, discourage participation in it. The pass system was also justified as a temporary measure, but according to oral accounts of Indigenous elders, this system was in use in the prairies at least up until the 1940s. In this model, the pass system, which is essentially restricting the basic human rights of Indigenous people to mobility within their own territories, it lives on today in Palestine. This includes a system of permits, checkpoints, and the apartheid wall, which restricts and regulates the movement of Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It also includes the almost hermetic siege of Gaza as the most extreme expression of control over movement to, from, and within the occupied Palestinian territories. And one thing I should mention is both the reserves and the pass system also had their equivalents in South Africa. In South Africa, of course, the reserves were known as Bantustans. In regular conversation, I've been told by a number of South Africans that back in the day, they referred to the Bantustans as the native reserves. They also had the similar system restricting movement. It was known as the Don't Pass system. Another strategy of Canada that I think has been borrowed and used quite effectively for its own purposes by Israel is quote-unquote negotiations, and the use of negotiations and talks as an extension of colonial power. As I said, I'm Blackfoot, when we live under Treaty 7, which was, I say negotiated in 1877. It's hard to say that the treaty was signed. There's still to this day a lot of controversy over, not other treaties as well, but especially with Treaty 7, I know there's a lot of controversy over whether anybody signed it, who signed it, like who were they speaking on behalf of when they signed it, and what was understood. Because to look at what's in the document versus like the oral history of the Treaty 7 negotiations, there's quite a bit of difference. That's a whole other, I think that's a big topic in and of itself. But definitely in 1877, it is a fact that negotiations did happen for that treaty. And part of what this treaty was understood was a peace treaty. When the negotiations and their setup at the camp, there was a very large presence of the Northwest Mounted Police, which later became the RCMP. They were there, and they had the camp where the different Indigenous communities were camped out, completely surrounded with cannons pointed inward. And this, I think this is like Canada's idea of peace negotiations, and this is the same. And this basically continues today. I mentioned in BC there's a treaty process, which is a vast array of different negotiations going on around BC. There's countless land claims discussions that are going on, comprehensive ones, specific ones. There's negotiations over royalties in different communities, per caps, negotiations over the jurisdiction of RCMP on reserves. There's land disputes that have been brought into the court system by Indigenous communities in Canada that are decades and decades old and show no sign of being resolved anytime soon. And then more recently, particularly in BC, there's a use of the public consultation law. And I think I think this use of negotiations is a very conscious delay tactic on the part of Canadian governments, Canadian government or Canadian corporations. Time and time again, either the government or a corporation will try to go into an Indigenous community and take as much land or resources as possible, or begin exploration drilling until they're met with opposition from that community. And then they'll say, okay, well, let's negotiate, and then they'll tie the community into the negotiations, or as I said, public consultation processes. And in the meantime, still try to steal the land or the resources that they're after. Or ideally, eventually make some sort of deal, usually against the wishes of most people within that community. I know that in recent years, for companies, their ability to do this has been weakened due to the opposition they face from Indigenous people. There was a 2004 court ruling, that clarified the duty to consult before these processes take place. But this method of negotiations is still definitely on the table, and I think this strategy of negotiations, basically negotiations as a means of war, has been tried many times against by Israel against the Palestinian national movement. When we talk about the Oslo I process, but there's Oslo II, there was a roadmap for peace. There was the Annapolis Summit. There's been quartet-sponsored peace talks, Egypt brokered talks. I think it's the same type of business, and so far it's had the same type of results for Palestinians as for Indigenous people. There was an article by Joseph Massad that was published in Al Jazeera English back in October, and it was discussing this strategy within the context of the statehood bid of 2011. And he was discussing what I just mentioned, the various negotiations that have been set up since 1991. And he said, the negotiations have been based on specific goals to end certain aspects of the Israeli relationship to the Palestinians, namely some of the parts introduced since the '67 war and occupation and the beginning of exclusive Jewish colonial settlement of these territories. But what always remains outside the purview of negotiations is the very core of the Palestinian-Israel relationship, which the Palestinians are told cannot be a part of any of these negotiations. And I think in most situations, and this is coming up quite regularly in BC in regards to different mining projects within BC, it's extremely disingenuous on the part of a company to say that it wants to engage in negotiations or consultation with the community when typically the community is quite clear. There's not much to negotiate in regards to removing minerals from their lands. The community will come out quite clearly and say no. Like, it's not negotiation, it's like no. Like, we do not want this extremely destructive development happening on our land. So to respond with negotiation, it really means that eventually their goal is to try and push that project through, knowing that that is not what the community wants to have done with its land. The final similarity that I want to talk about is the influence of neoliberalism within both like the Indigenous struggles and the Palestinian struggle. And I'm sorry, I just lost a page. I mentioned earlier the statehood bid that was brought by Mahmoud Abbas in September. One of the bases of support for this statehood initiative was from the IMF and the World Bank, and basically their support for this was that they produced a number of reports where looking at Palestine, particularly just the West Bank actually, based on certain economic indicators and indices of development of infrastructure, that Palestine was technically now ready from a strictly economic standpoint to have its own state. Completely without absolutely any discussion of the effects of the occupation on the Palestinian economy. You know, factors like economic infrastructure being bombed or knocked over by bulldozers, or blockades. There was a really interesting article written about a year ago in the Journal of Palestine Studies by Raja Khalidi and Sobi Savour. And the article is aptly titled Neoliberalism as Liberation. And I feel like, and I think, right, that this very similar strategies right now, both being promoted by the Canadian government and also over time more and more so being adopted by certain Indigenous and First Nations leaders within the Assembly of First Nations. You know, where there's a heavy promotion that there's the so-called solution to the different economic and social problems that Indigenous people face can be found within neoliberal economic development, the privatization of reserved lands, and similar policies. An example of this sort of thinking was an article from July 11th issue of the National Post. This is an article by a fellow by the name of Joseph Quinnell. He is a policy analyst for a think tank known as the Frontier Center for Public Policy. This article is kind of, I don't know, it seems, they seem very unironically to be calling themselves the Frontier Center. But the name of the article was Aboriginals Need Roadmap for Success, Not Ideology. And he started off the article with a question. Is it necessarily right-wing to recognize the role of the free market in elevating populations out of poverty? Accepting the reality of the success of free markets is not really a right-wing argument, but a mainstream acceptance of reality. Admittedly, my preferences are for societies with a free market and limited government, but those views have the added bonus of being ideas that produce the greatest good for the greatest number in societies they've been attempted. My hunch is the debate has not been that has been resolved all around the world that government ownership of the economy does not work and closing oneself off from the economy is bad, has not permeated Aboriginal discourse because academics and activists involved are ideologically opposed to capitalism despite evidence. They mythologize natives as community-oriented and want to keep Aboriginals from the dreaded free market. Sadly, they would rather see natives held back than admit political and intellectual failure. And he ends with, it is essential we provide booming Aboriginal populations with the tools they need to capitalize on property. They need a roadmap to succeed, not discredited ideology. So I don't know, there's a lot I could say about that. I mean, I think it's, I don't know, it's really, to me it seems to be like what could be more ideological than talking about the existence of a free market, let alone upholding its virtues, especially in, you know, state of the international economy in the last few years. But you know, I think like some of the stuff that's said there is quite ridiculous. But unfortunately, it is there is you know, these types of ideas are becoming more and more popular. They're pushed by a number of advisors and former advisors to the Conservative government, such as Tom Flanagan and Christopher Antiquera. There's on the First Nation side of things, people like Manny Jules who are really pushing these sort of things, these sort of policies. And again, within the context of Indigenous people, the main issue it comes down to is privatizing, which will eventually lead to the breaking off of the few pieces of contiguous territory that Indigenous people have. And I think what the biggest problem I have with this is the sort of underlying thinking is like, you know what, like, let's just forget about this whole colonial history and talk about how First Nations can be integrated into the economy further and out of our dependence. It's completely absent any sense of the real history of Indigenous people here and where our different economic and social problems stem from. There's no concept of rights in this type of thinking, sovereignty, injustice, reparations. So as much as some of these articles like this, like I said, it's from the National Post. It can be kind of ridiculous, but really, like, the implications of it, I think, are really scary. So those are a few of the similarities. Like, there's so many different connections to be made, and hopefully I did even now just maybe too many.
Ah.
But I think that this shared colonial history is really crucial to understanding Canada's support for Israel. Partly, I think that the similar nature of Canada and Israel as settler societies creates a solid foundation for an ideological affinity, where from the Canadian standpoint of view, there's nothing particularly problematic or controversial that you have a predominantly European population that would set up state in the lands of another racialized people, i.e. Palestine, displace those people and settle their land. And in some ways, in the current context with the Canadian government, this position is one to be celebrated, where Israel is still lauded as a so-called outpost of civilization, much in the way that the colonization of Turtle Island was justified as a civilizing mission. Whether that process was couched in traditions of European Christianity or narratives of modernization. As I mentioned, the realm of international politics is one of the areas in which Canada has played the most significant role as a proud and uncritical defender of Israel against attempts to address any of the numerous human rights violations and war crimes that it commits. I think Canada has its own interest in ensuring that Israel remains this immunity, because it is that same international arena where Indigenous people repeatedly try to hold Canada accountable for its human rights violations against Indigenous people. And I'll just actually, it's a regular arena, but just in the last 3 months, in December of 2011, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women announced that it would launch an inquiry into the murders and disappearances of Indigenous women and girls across Canada. A few weeks ago, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination condemned Canada's treatment of Indigenous people in terms of the continued extreme disparities in living conditions of Indigenous people versus the rest of the population. And also, a couple weeks ago, there was some really interesting statements made by the chair of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where he said that the residential schools were an act of genocide. I mean, I don't want to speak for all, but I think for most Indigenous people, there's nothing particularly new or shocking to describe the residential schools as a policy and an act of genocide. But I think it was significant that this was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was appointed by the Conservative government. And significantly, he made some statements when the interim report came out a few weeks ago that showed how Canada has actively tried to undermine international law as a way to protect itself. I'm going to quote, this is an article from the Globe and Mail from February 17th. The chairman of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission says removing more than 100,000 Aboriginal children from their homes and placing them in residential schools was an act of genocide. Justice Murray Sinclair says the UN defines genocide to include the removal of children based on race, then placing them with another race to indoctrinate them. He says Canada has been careful to ensure its residential school policy was not caught up in the UN's definition. And to quote him, "This is why the Minister of Indian Affairs can say this was not an act of genocide. But the reality is that to take children away and to place them in society for the purpose of racial indoctrination was and is an act of genocide." And this is just a few examples of ways where Canada itself has come under scrutiny at the international level for its treatment of Indigenous people. But in addition to the use of the UN as a means for Indigenous people to advance their struggles and seek accountability for Canada's human rights abuses, Canada has come under increased scrutiny around other matters as well, including the environmental impacts of the exploitation and expansion of the tar sands of Alberta, its continued export of asbestos to the global south, recent changes to its immigration policy, and the atrocious record of Canadian mining companies in regards to human rights abuses and displacement of also predominantly Indigenous people in Latin American countries. So this to me is really a key thing, because we have to understand that when Canada is defending Israel on the international stage and blocking investigations and culpability of Israel, it's upholding its own interests in a couple ways. First is that Canada is helping keep the UN and its various institutions weak and unable to properly uphold standards or prosecute violations of international law. And this would be whether it's by Israel or by Canada or any other country. And secondly, of course, it creates opportunities for Israel to return the favor in giving the support to Canada when it needs it. Finally, the Canadian government also benefits from its relationship with Israel by gaining access to Israel's experience and tools of repression, be it for their uses at home or in the case of Israeli drones for their lease and use in Afghanistan. I mentioned earlier the 2008 Canada and Israel Declaration of Intent for Cooperation on Public Security Issues. And this is a document that was signed by representatives of both governments that outlines Canada and Israel's, quote, common threats to border security, illegal immigration, and terrorist financing. And I think, although Canada has developed its own vast experience in this regard by the repeated use of the police, military, and CSIS to help subdue Indigenous resistance, but Israel has much to share with Canada in the way of more high-tech 21st century means of policing, security, and intelligence gathering that it's developed over decades of repression and warfare against Palestinians. And in addition to the more overt forms of violent repression, this also includes the repeated use of the quote-unquote terrorism label to try and discredit the Palestinian movement and to smear it. This type of smear campaigns, these types of campaigns are being used now more and more regularly by the Canadian government to discredit Indigenous people and their issues, and also recently to smear both Indigenous and non-Indigenous opposition to the expansion of the Alberta tar sands and its associated pipeline projects. So just to conclude, to me the purpose of one of the main purposes of making these connections and understanding them is that in order for successful Palestine solidarity work in Canada to happen, the colonial nature of Canada has to be recognized. And I think for Canadians working in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, it must never be forgotten that Indigenous people here are struggling every day to survive the numerous ways in which Canadian colonialism and apartheid has damaged and continues to damage the original people whose land this country was built on. And I don't think it's just a matter of being morally consistent in opposing apartheid and colonialism wherever it is. That is important. But I think beyond that, really any struggle for justice or solidarity work in Canada needs to bear in mind how all struggles in Canada will benefit in the short and long run by supporting Indigenous struggles for sovereignty here. Due to the unique way that our struggles directly challenge the hegemony of Canadian capitalism and the damage that it does. And I think something else that can't be understated is that for non-Indigenous people here to do effective solidarity work for Palestinians, it's really critical to come to terms with what it means to also be part of a settler society and the ramifications of that for Indigenous people and for non-Indigenous people. And I think coming to terms with that can only make the ability for people here to support the Palestinian struggle against Israeli settler colonialism stronger. And finally, for Indigenous people, I think Indigenous people here in Canada and more broadly in Turtle Island, I think it's important for us to support the Palestinian struggle. For me, it just comes down to extending the basic concepts of solidarity. I mean, we're many different communities and many different nations, but we come together time and time again to support each other's struggles. I think in some ways that mutual support and solidarity is really part of what defines being Indigenous. And as I said, it's nothing new to extend that beyond the borders of Canada or beyond Turtle Island, and extending that solidarity to include the struggles of Palestinian people. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Mike for what he said, and I'd like you to think about what he said, because there is a movement for Indigenous people worldwide to come together to support one another. And we find when we get together how similar it is. And that's because oppression, colonialism, capitalism, it's the same worldwide. And if everybody goes far enough back, you're all indigenous to somewhere. And if you're Caucasian, you have been oppressed longer than we have. They took away your basis to Mother Earth long before they took it away from us. So you have a longer journey to find out who you were. And so my heart goes out to you. And we need to come back finally together as one people, as people of the sacred hoop of all colors. And we must respect and love and honor one another and stop this devastation, this apartheid, this colonization, no matter where it is. Like I said earlier, the honor of one is the honor of all. And I also forgot to say something earlier. We have a brother in this struggle that's part of our Regina Solidarity group, and he called me right before I came here, and his name's Ahmed, and he really is feeling really bad. He can't be here, but his son has been sick for many days, and he asked me to please apologize to everybody, and I almost forgot to do that. I probably would have. He's like a brother to me. I would have gotten a scolding. So anyways, I have to bring that up, but I would like to field questions for Mike. So if there's questions, please feel free. That's how we dialogue, that's how we understand one another, and that's how we come together. So, any questions?
I noticed that you just mentioned about Squamish, because I know when I was living in BC, that's when we were still talking about the native land settlement.
Mm-hmm.
So how much it has been developed since from 2008?
With Squamish?
Or
Are you asking about the treaties that they're trying to implement?
yeah.
Well, in particular to Squamish, not very far.
It's part
yeah.
of the Victorian area.
Well,
I was thinking of one that was right in Vancouver there.
Stella, what are you wanting to ask? I'm trying to get clear here.
Well, they just started doing the treaty talk, or
Oh, yeah.
the land settlement in around Vancouver area. Turkish
That
Bay.
negotiation you're talking about.
Do you mean that the Tsawasan?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, just I guess for people who don't, like I mean, I mentioned a little bit the BC treaty process. And again, it's based on the fact that you know, the vast majority of territory within BC was never ceded with the treaty. So in the early, was it 1992? The Treaty Commission was set up, and it was in anticipation of increased resistance. This is only a couple of years after the standoff in Oka, but there was it was becoming more of an issue. People were really realizing, like, hey, wait a second, you know. And I noticed that difference having grown up in BC. Like for Indigenous people from an early age, there's like a different sense and a different consciousness, because again, there's no treaty. There's nothing. There's not the government has nothing they can point to saying it's fair and square. So the understanding of what's happened is much stronger. And I mentioned Treaty 7 and the other treaties. As bad as they are, what's being attempted through the BC treaty process is even worse. Inherent to any discussions is a precondition that each First Nation that engages in negotiations has to completely surrender that Indigenous title, completely. The negotiations that have happened, there's been somewhat of an expansion of the reserves, but it's converting the reserves into what's known as fee simple. It's basically private property, and what this means is that land can then be sold, or more significant is that it can be used as collateral for taking out loans. And it's part of what's being pushed, not just in BC but in other reserves with this fee simple property relations, is pushing economic projects that in my mind are pretty much doomed to fail from the outset. And the only collateral that a reserve has is its land. So when the project goes belly up and the bank wants its money back, like that's all that can be given away is the land. It's already something that's happening, and this is the biggest fear that especially Indigenous communities in BC, have about the treaty process. So the Tsawwassen did sign on to it, and their sovereignty for the Tsawwassen First Nations means they've literally been reduced to the status of a municipality. They have a seat in the municipal, in the regional district of Metro Vancouver, and yeah, they're participating in a rapid redevelopment of the Delta Port right beside the reserve. They're building what's going to be one of the biggest shopping malls in BC. But they are one of the few. They're one of the few First Nations that has even opted into negotiating the treaty, let alone settling one. At last count, I believe, out of 208 different First Nations that could technically enter negotiations within the BC modern treaty process, only 50 have even started negotiations, let alone moved along to the fifth, sixth, final stages of actually ratifying the treaty.
I think we have another question right here.
Yeah, just a heads up on what's going on today. Cornell's an idiot. He just plagiarizes people. You know, look, take the Indian Act thing a bit further. On the surface, it looks like a privatization of land and all that sort of stuff. What it's really about, and this comes out of Enbridge on the pipeline, when the people in BC started to rise up against it, they didn't know how to deal with it. So they immediately appealed to the federal government, said intervene and start some negotiations, land, resources, things. Take a look at the Indian Act and taxation exemption and how it applies to co-venture on a reserve. So it may not necessarily be to get rid of the reserve, but just to get rid of all the bureaucracy within Indian affairs, so direct relationships can go on between a corporation after resource-rich areas without the federal government impeding the process, just facilitating it, and then look and see what happens between taxation exemption, right, for the corporations. If they're in joint venture, they don't pay. Then they can turn over and do royalties to the people, you know, and blah, blah, blah down the line. But it's to facilitate big capital resources as cheaply as possible. Just a heads up. The other stuff, Flanagan's sinister, son of a bitch, you know, and you got to know how to talk to him to get what you want out of him. And that's, you know.
I don't know what I want out of him.
You know what you have to do.
The affinity that the First Nation people of Canada, Turtle Island have with the Palestinian people, it represented an extremely great case in my opinion. What I would like to know is, do you have any idea about other Indigenous populations in other countries, whether or not there is a connection as well? I've never heard of it, and I'm sure there has to be. Because I'm picturing this worldwide movement of Indigenous peoples involved in this issue and in support of the Palestinian people. Can you speak to that and about, you know, how big this movement is worldwide? Can somebody here?
Well, I can.
Go ahead.
Okay. It's very complex because as Indigenous people we have met and we are meeting all the time and we are in constant contact and we support one another's struggle worldwide. And Palestinians are included in that because they're Indigenous. And if you're saying it's just a support Palestine movement that's big, there's really nothing that I know of like that, but we are there for one another. In fact, I'm a Facebook addict, I confess. And there was something posted from the Mohawk Nation, and they put a big banner right in their territory that supported Palestinians and said, we understand. And there's many things that are going around Palestinians we understand as Indigenous people, because everything that happened there, I often think we were the guinea pigs, and now they can take it everywhere. What they did to us went to South Africa, even dividing us. Like, in the U.S., there's no such thing as Métis or treaty or whatever. You're Indian or you're not up to a quarter blood. And here they divided us because, that we better divide them. And so they took that same thing to South Africa, where you were black and you were colored and you were whatever you were. And so they divided us up here. They create divisions all over the place. So we have to understand, from Canada, that's where apartheid began. And that's why Canadians have a big debt to end apartheid anywhere, because it came from right here. Do you have anything else there?
No.
I've got pictures in my head of New Zealand, the Maori New Zealand, for instance, or Australian Indigenous people.
They do support.
Or, you know, in different countries in South America. Or is there the same zeal? Is there the same concept of brotherhood, so to speak?
Well, South America is stronger than we are.
Okay.
I do lots of work in South America and I don't even want to come home.
Yeah.
Because it's so strong, and the brotherhood and the sisterhood and the standing up. Wonderful woman in Copenhagen who's a Maori that lives in Australia, and she's always out there promoting all Indigenous struggle in Palestine and everything. So it's all over. We recognize one another as Indigenous brothers and sisters, and we sit down and we talk and we understand what's going on.
It's good for me to know that, because my worldview is very small in that area, so I appreciate the answer.
Do you know of any other big meetings that are going on with Indigenous people other than that we all support one another? Yeah.
My question is, like she was talking about Indigenous solidarity around the world. For example, the Zapatistas on, I'm sure, I'm pretty sure, practice solidarity with one another. But my question is, in reference to their political objectives, the fact that they're anti-capitalist, of course against colonialism and whatnot. I'm wondering if this movement here, which you're talking about, supports the same politics of anti-capitalism.
How would you tackle that?
Yeah.
And then I'll say something in the Zapatista community.
That's a good question, because I heard a lot of mentions of capitalism as an enemy in speech here, so I'm curious as well.
Yeah, well, as you probably won't be surprised, of course, like, Indigenous people think in many different ways. We have many politics, we have many differences. It's different, whether it's based on just political differences or it's just actual interests that play out within communities or within cities. So, in regards to that politics, I can only speak for myself, who is an anti-capitalist. Yeah, the way I see it is that, in terms of obviously Canada is a capitalist economy. It's one that is very damaging to people here, not just Indigenous people, and is damaging to people elsewhere in the world. Canada is not a peacekeeping country. It's the practices of the companies. I mentioned mining interests in Latin America, the continued export of asbestos. These are some of the ways. These are, that is Canada to me. But the foundation of Canada and its economy is the theft of Indigenous lands. Like, that is, if we're going to talk in anti-capitalist, an anti-capitalist economic framework, I think the expropriation of Indigenous territory as a resource in Canada is basically permanent accumulation. And I think Indigenous struggles still do pose, by Indigenous people asserting their rights to their lands and to decide what will and will not happen with their lands, and also to fight for reparations, and to challenge the poverty we face. All of these things do fundamentally pose a challenge to that. So I can't say, certainly not every Indigenous person who decides to get involved in asserting their rights sees it that way. And certainly the ones that sell us out don't see it that way. But for me, I think, definitely for non-Indigenous people, if your understanding like mine is that, the ability to attain any semblance of social justice, economic equality, is not possible within the confines of capitalism, then definitely, as I said, I think those struggles have can only gain by supporting Indigenous struggles. Because I think for Indigenous people it's the same way. That's why I brought up the issue of neoliberalism, is like these types of policies. Like for me, the solution is not more capitalism. So I don't know if that answers your.
And if you want to talk about the Zapatista movement,
Right.
the Zapatista movement isn't just an Indigenous movement. It started by Indigenous people for Indigenous people, but if you go into it, it's a very humanitarian movement. It's for all people. It's to create a new world and a new system. And everybody sees Zapatista, terrorist, armed confrontation, armed struggle. That's not what it is at all. They had, at one point they were being murdered and they stood up for themselves. But I had the honor of going to a Zapatista community, and it was the most incredible experience I've ever had. Because if we could all live like that, we would be fine. They had a clinic that was incredible. There was schools. There was cooperatives for food, for selling arts, for doing everything. And it was incredible, the health of that community. And even the governance system, if Canada and the whole world could be governed like that, we'd have no corruption, because it's governed by elders, women, youth, men, and they have a certain period where they govern, and they come from, whether they're a farmer, they're running a cooperative, they're a teacher, they come there for a period of time, they can have no benefits. When their period's over, they go back exactly to where they came from, and the next comes in. Just think, if we were ruled like that, we would not have the corruption we have. So we've got to take that thing about what being a Zapatista is, not as militant, but creating a new structure and a new system where we can all live healthily.
Like the Mennonites?
Sort of. Sort of, yeah.
I just,
Yeah.
I remember, because I made
Wait, Stella, there's some other questions. We'll come back to you.
Yeah, I find this overreading really intriguing, talking about the solidarity of Indigenous groups, and specifically with the Palestinians. I understand this BDS campaign has sort of this goal, but I guess my question is, what is the end objective or goal of the BDS campaign? Or I guess to word my question differently, like what is the desire that people are trying to accomplish in doing this? Or what would it take for the nation of Israel to be in your good books again?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's just a really simple answer, because fortunately that's all very explicit in terms of the demands that came out of the 2005 call. It's not just a call with demands. The campaign ends once those demands are fulfilled, right? So the first one is an end to the theft and colonization of all Arab lands in Palestine and elsewhere. The second one is equal rights for all Arabs in the state of Israel, full equality. And the third one is the right of return. So essentially it's, for Israel to fulfill its responsibilities under international law. And once it does that, then we're out.
So what would that look like for the state of Israel?
It would mean allowing refugees to return home as stipulated by UN Resolution 194 and international law. It would mean no longer settling and colonizing Arab lands illegally in contravention of international law and the Geneva Conventions. It would mean granting Arab citizens the same rights as Jewish citizens in Israel.
But they do have the same rights. They can vote, they can run in parliament, they can...
Okay, but we have to go in order for questions. So I just want to get some order here. You can raise your hand and you can have a question, but we need to have some order. It's not a shout out. We need to have order, and we need to go in order of questions. And also I'd like to say Indigenous solidarity isn't necessarily a BDS movement. It's a whole different, it can be a component of it, but Indigenous solidarity for each other all around the world isn't necessarily BDS. It's solidarity and standing together and understanding the sorrow and the intergenerational grief and the oppression that's happened to us. We cannot confuse A and B, and it's a valid question. how do we answer that all? Go ahead, Mel.
Well, I think if I can just sort of cut to the chase of where I think you're going with this, it's a really interesting discussion because I think, what we commonly hear in response to the BDS goals are, what they're really asking for is the destruction of Israel, right? Because if we comply with international law, then Israel no longer exists. So to me, I think that's a very telling statement, right? That Israel cannot exist except for on, the premises of institutionalized racism, of ongoing displacement and colonization. Like, these are the core tenets upon which the state exists. And if something like equality and justice means the dissolution of that state, which I would say is true of Canada as well, then I'm all for that dissolution. But personally, I can't speak on behalf of the campaign, I can't speak on behalf of the Palestinian National Committee, but like for me personally, any state that's existence is premised on oppression, on racism, on institutionalized injustice, and I'm all for its dissolution.
Did you have a question? No?
I just have to say, I guess it's nice that you're able to speak your opinion, and here in Canada, even though it might be different than other people's opinions, even though it might be in contrast to what our government stands for. That's because we have freedom of speech in Canada, as there is also freedom of speech in Israel, and that is not an apartheid state.
I will come to you, but I want you to understand that peace doesn't mean that you're going to disappear. That's the problem we have had in the Americas for 519 years when we talk about self-government, when we talk about justice. Everybody says, oh, does that mean I have to go home? Of course it doesn't mean anybody has to go home. Unfortunately, as Indigenous people, we are too kind, and we are too giving, and we believe in sharing. It's one of our cultural aspects. And so it's the same thing with our Indigenous Palestinian brothers. It doesn't mean everybody gets erased. It means, come on, let's all be equal.
I just wanted to say that you mentioned up until 1940 that people had to get passes to leave the reservation. My sister is from Palestine and Ramallah, and the first time she came to Canada, it was really interesting because we went to Regina Beach, and it was the first time that she hadn't gotten stopped at a checkpoint. She had her passport to go to Regina Beach. You guys know how close that is. And I couldn't believe it. It was just like, wow, so it's equality. It's like, my parents, my grandparents were always allowed, from my mom's side of the family anyway. My mother's Ukrainian and my father's Métis. My mother's side of the family has always been able to move around this country freely. Yafa was born in Jerusalem and she can't even go there. That's all. It's just equality.
I just,
Yes. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
yeah, I think just to respond in terms, I think it seems like it's particularly in regards to Palestine, where the limits of so-called freedom of speech in Canada really show themselves and have shown themselves. In terms of like just this, along with other Israeli apartheid weeks, the attempts within what's supposed to be like institutions of higher learning, the attempts to suppress any honest discussions about what Israel's doing to Palestine, shows the limits of free speech within Canada. And as I already mentioned, I think the what's going on right now with the smear campaigns against opposition to the tar sand and the pipelines is the language that people are that were terrorists. Again, this is for advocacy or so-called freedom of speech that you're talking about. That the Indigenous communities opposing the pipeline are funded by foreign interests. This is again and again repeated. But this is just like the most recent example. Like the use of the language of terrorism and the terrorists against Indigenous people is comes up, and again it's being used more. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was in 2006 where there was the draft counterterrorism manual for Canada, where they discussed potential terrorist threats, and they listed Indigenous warrior societies as a terrorist organization. And there was a huge outcry, and they pulled it. But this is their mentality. And I did mention Oka, but I think one thing in regards to, like, I won't even discuss the complete lack of freedom of speech, and basic rights, democratic rights that Palestinians have within Israel, within the occupied territories. But within the context of Canada, I think there's a really there's a constant shift between more like direct uses of force and indirect. And a lot of the type of more like direct violence and murder and repression that happens against Palestinians now is more of a historical thing within Canada, as a regular, like, daily routinized aspect of Canadian colonialism. But it's still, but it does come up. The Canadian government is not above using its military against Indigenous people when push comes to shove. Some of the most major operations of the Canadian military have been within its borders against Indigenous people. And then, of course, I don't want to reduce the uses of violence by the Canadian state just in regards to sort of like blockades and flare-ups. There was a crime bill that was discussed. There's the institution of incarceration of Indigenous people, well above rates of incarceration for non-Indigenous people in Canada. But I just think the idea of the idea of freedom of speech is a very problematic concept for Canada, and I don't think it's an absolute or real right that exists depending on what people talk about, and not only what they talk about, but how what they talk about influences what they actually do.
I had one question here, one there, a third one there, and a fourth one there, so go in this order. You're first.
In the prior to the civil rights movement, it's sort of still remnants of that. Of course, there was the Jim Crow laws in the United States. Yet there were still constitutional protections, and blacks still in the United States had the right to vote. There was black representatives, for example, in the state of Georgia. You had the freedom of assembly and what have you. Those were constitutional guarantees. But yet under Jim Crow's laws, there was segregation nonetheless. Even though the United States at the time was still considered a beacon of democracy and a shining beacon upon the hill. The eventual upbringing, through the civil rights movement, the Jim Crow laws, through federal means, were suspended, and it did not bring the dissolution of the United States nor the state of Georgia or any other state that had segregation. The end of apartheid laws, what have you, did not brought the end of apartheid. What it brought about was the end of some systematic discrimination and inequalities. And I would say, just as an opinion, if there's full equality in implementation of international law and human rights, and though there may be, just as there were in segregation in the United States, rights guaranteed to Palestinians living inside Israel, I still think that that type of free society would probably be more admirable than what currently exists now and what currently exists in segregation in the United States. But I guess my question is, and seriously, I don't mean to ask this in a loaded manner, but just as your opinion and your opinion as Indigenous people, we still continually have both, directly through such matters as the Indian Act and indirectly through the current policies that exist. What kind of Canada would exist if there was actually true substantive inequality? And do you think that non-Indigenous Canadians would still be proud to call themselves Canadians?
Did you mean inequality or
Equality. He means equality.
You won't be surprised, it's quite a difficult question to really answer. Because I think part of the issue is, and really, like, for Indigenous people and for non-Indigenous people, I mean, what we're talking about is decolonization. And as you mentioned as an example with South Africa, there was the formal end of apartheid, but still many of its legacies and even the systems that still exist, the discrimination, inequities. And similarly, within the most other areas of the world, we used to be called the Third World, now we're known as the Global South. There's a process of decolonization. It's been shown to be very limited for the people, but these are struggles that came up and achieved at least a formal decolonization and political independence. I think in Canada we're very far from that, and I think something that's, I think for myself anyway, and other people I've been talking to, I use the word, I talked about colonialism a lot, but there's a big difference when it's a settler society, and it's really like a process of settler colonialism. You know, and what I think with what it means for like a society such as Canada's, where the majority of the people are non-Indigenous, and what it means to decolonize. It's to me, it's an unknown because it hasn't come into effect. Like there's very few examples of settler societies that have ceased to exist as such in any sort of sort of just manner. You know, if you're asking indirectly if I think that it means that all non-Indigenous people have to go back to wherever they came from, like, of course not. but I think it's I find that it's the biggest factor to sort of grapple with is that I really feel like it's such a small segment of the non-Indigenous population that is willing to support Indigenous people in a meaningful way. Like that's the biggest, you know, like that's our demographic problem. You know, to put it any other way. And I think with Palestine, it's the same issue. You know, the number of people within Israeli society who are Jewish who are willing to, not talking about like general like vaguely defined sort of like human rights work, but willing to be like to stand as the occupying settlers and say, okay, like, you know, address like what Palestinians are actually asking for. It's such a small amount of the population. You know, and these are the biggest things. You know, so in some ways, I guess what I'm saying is I think the question is more something to be taken up by non-Indigenous people. You know, what will it take for the relationship to change?
Also, we have to think about what was a treaty. A treaty means a nation-to-nation agreement. And basically we are sovereign nations because of treaties. And if you go further and you go into the Mohawk, where they hit first in Canada, they had what they call the two-row wampum. And that was a peace that we could live in parallel worlds to one another and have that peace and govern ourselves how we saw fit. To me, I can't answer that either, but if I were a settler, which I'm not, but if I were, I would think I would be really proud if I could find a country to live in where we would have peace and justice and that we could live in harmony together. What pride. I know that a lot of people don't think that, but I mean, we're preaching to the choir here, but what pride somebody would have in saying, hey, I live in such a just society that we can live in harmony.
I think I forgot what I was going to ask, but I just want to congratulate. Like, thanks for speaking and putting this on. It's pretty. My name's Keith Lee, by the way. It's pretty heated around Regina. We've hit almost nationwide coverage for some of our activities from the BDS and Israeli Apartheid Week. And I guess what I'm asking is some real concrete questions to maybe concrete answers that we can figure out tonight. One of the stories, I think it was in Global, that was just released, that Stephen Harper believes Israeli Apartheid Week is anti-Semitic and racist. That's the opening sentence of the story. And that bothered me in a sense, because isn't that defamation of character? Isn't that libel? Because don't you need proof? I guess what my question is, when it comes to terms and building and destroying narratives, can't we legally press charges, or, you know, and find out that whether it does constitute racism or not, and then get to the framework? Or is that just building up the courts?
Answer that question.
Okay, if you're a lawyer.
Libel is an individual. I don't think you can libel a group. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you that I think there's things that are being said that.
So who has the onus to prove who then?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm not saying I agree with Stephen Harper. I just think that's partly why it's possible to make these kinds of statements about groups, because you're not libeling an individual. You know, so there's no legal.
But if I call a certain group race, I'm charged. You know, it works the other way, but it doesn't work when we're understand how that works.
The arbitrary cutoff is actually 25 people.
When, yeah,
No, I mean,
but it's a real important issue because I think if you don't find those fundamental, take it to court and challenge that, you'll always get mud thrown in your eye or lose your narrative, your tiny momentum, and be whitewashed, won't you? Or?
I don't know, so I think we need to come back to this later on and keep going. But you have, the one thing I'd like to say though is that every time I've been to an Israeli apartheid gathering, somebody speaking, especially from Palestine, I have always heard them talk about wanting peace for Jews and for Arabs, and for justice for Jews and for Arabs, and they have always acknowledged the Jewish people that are standing up for them. And it's beyond me why we keep hearing it's anti-Semitic and racist when I keep hearing such peace and harmony. But then I guess sometimes when I speak truth, everybody's telling me I'm angry. Oh, I'm an angry First Nations woman. I'm thinking, well, I'm not even angry. I'm just telling you a truth. So maybe it's like that, and maybe people have to start listening. And now we'll go back to the other question, and then we have you.
Well, I had a couple questions. Mike, I really enjoyed the presentation tonight, and as a Métis person myself, I certainly saw some of the connections that you made. I have been twice to the land of Israel, and I guess what really struck me in my first visit to Israel was the amazing unity that I did see building between Palestinians and Jewish people within the land. So I'm not getting into the West Bank issues at this point, but I actually found it extremely powerful because I went to Israel the first time thinking there would be these divergent segregations between populations, right? And it wasn't like that at all. It was very much like Canada, where, you know, Arab owner, half the workers were from, you know, like it was just a very beautiful thing to me to see the unity that has been built within the nation of Israel. And I actually spent 3 months working primarily in the West Bank in 2011. And, you know, certainly have seen the challenges firsthand, have seen what some of these peace agreements have done to people, the kinds of, you know, for example, I remember being up on Mount Gerizim a little while ago and looking down over the city of Shechem and hanging out with some vineyard owners and, you know, Samaritan people who told me these used to be their neighbors. They used to trade, do commerce and business with these people, but now because of peace agreements, that's cut off. And those poor people that are living in Shechem are some of the most demoralized, in most difficult situations ever because they don't have access to those kind of relationships or opportunities anymore. So to me, I think that Israel is probably the only land where peace agreement actually means division. But my question was, just after listening to your talk tonight, do you feel that the Jews have a legal right, given their cultural, archaeological, historical, architectural, and moral attachment to the land for 3,500 years to be in the land? And my second question, because you focus so much on the Palestinian indigenous people, what about the more than double the population of Jewish indigenous people that were also present in the land in 1948? I was just curious, what kind of cooperative efforts as First Nations people are we making? Because I do know groups of First Nations people that have gone to Israel and, you know, done a lot of solidarity work with her and care very deeply about the Palestinian people and very deeply about the Jewish people. So I guess tonight, in listening to your conversation, I just was curious about, like, where do we see our role as actually being peacekeepers? Because as Canadians, that's what I always see myself first when I travel, being a peacekeeper, and hopefully bringing, you know, healing into every situation, whether it be Indigenous Jews, Indigenous Palestinians, or whatever that may be. Where are our efforts on that front?
Well, it's definitely more than one question in there.
Yeah, two main ones that I'd just like you to address.
Well, I think that I'll start with the last question first. As I think I outlined, like I think the whole story of Canada as a peacekeeping country, to be polite, is really problematic. And I would have thought that after the type of presentation that I gave, if you acknowledge even parts of Canada's real history in regards to Indigenous people here, the idea that Canada was founded on peace values is it's.
I get that. I get that really horrible things have been done throughout our history.
But you were talking about upholding Canada's values of peacekeeping. Which values are you referring to? Are you referring to like what's going on in Afghanistan right now?
Sorry, what?
Like what about like Canada's role in Afghanistan? You consider that peacekeeping? Like what are you talking about? And as I did briefly outline, that does include Canada leasing Israeli drones and using them to bomb civilian populations. So like what is your understanding of this peacekeeping history they want to uphold? Because for me it means getting to the root of problems like war, colonialism, occupation, and ending them. To me, that's making peace. Yeah, there were definitely prior to the formation of Israel, there was a Jewish population in historic Palestine. Some of them that are still alive consider themselves Jewish Palestinians. I think there's a huge problem in relating that population, which was one of many populations in Palestine, therefore entitles people primarily of Jewish descent in Europe, who, to be frank, don't have that historic connection other than to religion. If they did have that connection, I think it comes back to what was mentioned in terms of like two-row wampum. There's a difference between sharing a land and deciding that one people has the right to colonize that land to the exclusion of other people, which is what happened. There's a very big difference between the two, and that's what the issue is about.
And we had another question over here.
Kelsey basically asked my question already. It was about what sort of vision you, Mike, would have for a progressive coexistence of the settlers of Canada from centuries ago and the Indigenous people now. Like, what can we do to build a vision that is acceptable? Like, you've been outlining a lot of problems with the treaty process and the lack of treaties, and I mean, never mind that, just simply the settlement and colonization of this land to the exclusion of the Indigenous people. But as you've recognized already, you don't want to send me to England because 3-4 generations ago my ancestors came here. That's not something that anyone's really considering as a viable option. So I would love to have another meeting like this where we discuss what sort of positive vision we could come up with that does satisfy the needs of Indigenous people without, and the people who've colonized this land in much, much more recent years.
Can I add something to that? It has just occurred recently. Many of you may know about this. At the University of Regina, there's a young woman who has started a petition that would make mandatory 100-level classes for all faculties in the whole university. Just one young woman who felt there was a need for this. She's contacted universities right in the country. She's had all kinds of support in this from the university, from other places in the country. I teach a group of young people, and just today, now they're mixed. There's non-Indigenous people in this class, and I told them about this. And I said, I would like to know your opinion. What do you think? Do you think that this is something reasonable to do? Do you believe that when you get to a point where you'll be in university, that you should have a mandatory class, that you should be forced to take a class where you would learn about the basics of our Canadian history and the Indigenous people who were here? And invariably, every single one of them gave me a response. Absolutely. Because we didn't learn this in school. Or if we did learn something, it was nothing like what I've learned since I've been in this class with my Indigenous friends when we talked about history. We have so little knowledge. And for me, that's the basis of that question, is how would we ever live together in a peaceful existence? The basis for me as a non-Indigenous person is understanding that history, understanding where we have come from. The whole thing, the colonization, the residential schools, all the basics, understanding something about that so that we can have a picture of what's happened in the past cannot happen in the future. Where we are going in the future has to be related to what happened in the past. We have to understand that. That's the only way I see a beginning of it, is education of our children. We have to start educating them. We know that some of the elementary schools have materials they can use for educating young people, but it's not mandatory currently. I have friends who are teachers in elementary school. It's not mandatory. The teachers don't have to use this information. They don't have to teach their kids about the history of First Nation people. So that for me is the start.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously a huge question and an ongoing discussion that will continue for many years, but I think in some ways it can be a lot more concrete than we perceive it to be, in the sense that I think the first step is to stop doing harm, right? Like stop expropriating land, stop apprehending Indigenous children. We have more Indigenous children.
Quit murdering women.
Than wherever in residential school. Like we can stop incarcerating overwhelming numbers of Indigenous people right now. I mean, of course, those things aren't easy, but our immediate task is to organize movements that are capable of living those kinds of demands and tying that into all of the other struggles that we're involved in and we've been part of. And I think those are questions that we have to be asking among ourselves as settlers. Like, it's our leaders that are responsible for this, right? And I don't think we can. This is a discussion that obviously has to happen collaboratively between Indigenous people and settlers, but I think we have to recognize that we're the ones doing damage, and we can immediately, like, the first step should be to stop that damage, and then we can move toward the process of undoing that harm and what the lasting decolonization looks like.
And we need to dialogue, and we all need to decolonize, all of us, settlers and the colonized, because we've all bought into there's this wonderful book called Columbus and Other Cannibals, and it's called a Wetigo psychosis, and a Wetigo is a spirit that consumed everything, ate everything up, and now we're all sick with that psychosis. Like we talked about our leadership and the different dynamics of where we are, and we all need to heal from that Wetigo psychosis, and we need to sit down and dialogue and get to know one another. In South Dakota, for many generations, the ranchers were killing Indians on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and all of a sudden our uranium came in and was starting to take farmers' land, so they decided to come together and talk to the Indian people around them and say, hey, what are we going to talk to the Indian people around them and say, hey, what are we going to do here? And they started to see each other as people, and they created the most wonderful group called the CIA, the Cowboy Indian Alliance. and I met this man. I went on a march to protect the Black Hills, and he said, I learned so much. I was guilty of being a racist. And when I sat down and I met my neighbor, I realized that he had the same sorrows, or she had the same problems with her children, or he had this and I had that. And from now on, I will stand up for Indigenous people. It is the cross I will bear for the rest of my life for what I have done. And he said, and I have lost friends for this, but I don't care. And it really touched me. So we must sit down as people and say, okay, what are the issues? How do we make them happen? And as Val said, stop the harm, and then let's dialogue while we're stopping that harm, and let's come together and work it out.
Very well said.
are not the, how can I say, we do not own anything. We do not own the land. We are workers. We sell our labor. And in that sense, we all belong to the greater class, the working class. We all belong to the same class as settlers and natives. We all have a common bond to fight oppression, to fight our leaders, to fight, how can I say, the elite that is controlling our country. Religion, race, class has been used all around the world to gather wealth. The main reason is to gather wealth. It's not to spread religion or any other thing we would tell the television that we believe. It's to gather wealth, and we are not the ones gathering this wealth. Canadian companies are profiteering from imperialism in Palestine, Afghanistan, Iraq, Mexico,
Canada,
pretty much all around the world, and we are not the ones profiting. Well, at least we are in a sense. Certain of us are profiting from this, but we are not seeing. It's not in our interest, and as a class, we should find ways to work together to fight imperialism, colonialism, classism, sexism, all these different things. And that's a good building point to start, not only in solidarity, but as a world movement against capitalism, colonialism, all these things that are interlocked, that are linked.
Yes.
Just a little bit of information, on Indigenous. Just watch for the future that happened with South Africa and apartheid. They'll play the Indigenous card. The South Africans did. They cultivated relationships with the Aboriginal people. They played them off against the Mulroney government. They took them to South Africa, gave them a big tour, and brought them back, and they went on the media all over the place and said there's nothing wrong with South Africa. The pro-Israel lobby in Canada has already done that. It started over David Hennique. And, all right, this ism stuff. I got in on that one.
Okay.
Some of us defended David Hennique. I won't get too long. We defended him. He should never have been charged. It killed him. And so we got into it. And the accusations came. Always discreet. You are eschewing anti-Semitism. And I said, are you calling me an anti-Semite?
Right.
Not at all.
Yeah. It's always that little...
So watch they'll play it, because Israel is spreading people out in the Western world. They're getting weak now. They'll play it.
Okay, we got, Mike has something to say, and then I'm going to take one more question, and Val has an announcement.
Yeah, no, I think that was, I was going to address that. Yeah, and I think it has probably the biggest trip was the 2006 delegation by Phil Fontaine and the Assembly of First Nations. And I think it really was, yeah, the root of it was, I mean, I think organizations that support Israel, or the lobby of Israel, if you will, in Canada, it definitely targets many different populations or communities within Canada, but certainly used. I mean, I'll say it, like the statements David Hennique made, they were reprehensible.
Of course.
They were messed up. Yeah. They were anti-Semitic. That has nothing to do with supporting Israel. Like there's a conflation that Israel equals Jewishness, and I think it really. The organizations like the Canadian Jewish Congress that helped fund that trip, and since then I've cultivated with at least certain Indigenous, or I will say First Nations leaders, these delegations and statements in support of Israel. Yeah, they really took advantage of that situation. Yeah, I find it's to me, and one of the questions that was raised was a perfect example of it, where I find it very frustrating, which is. Basically, I see it as an appropriation of indigeneity to apply this really false connection between the founding of the State of Israel and Indigenous people here. And I think it's consciously done within Canada, partly because I think there is an understanding that there is a threat posed by making these connections between Indigenous struggles here and those in Palestine. So basically undermine that connection and that understanding by turning reality on its head. And to me, it's no coincidence. Like the types of leaders that have made the statements, for the most part that I've seen, in standing with Israel, are people that do not have the respect of their people. And it's hard to get Indigenous people to care about taking on this issue even if they support Palestine, because they're like, people like Phil Fontaine, they don't do anything for us. Like why should we expect that they're going to betray the Palestinian people if they betray us every day? And that's basically what I would call it. You know, there's other issues. I mean, there is a huge influence of Christianity, and a lot of the tours by Indigenous people to Israel are based within a Christian framework and not an Indigenous one. Because this is worth pointing out. You know, I think again, as I said, the idea that there's a similarity between the experience of Indigenous people here and predominantly European Jewish people who colonized Palestine. It seems like they would be, even if it was true, I think Israel would get itself in real trouble if it pushed that connection too far, because it's saying, well, shouldn't you be happy? Like the people got their land back after so many years. So is a conservative government in Canada or any government in Canada that is actively colonizing Indigenous people here going to be happy with that? Like is that a real connection? You know, again, hypothetically, even if it was true that Israel was an active in Indigenous people getting their land back, which it is not, even if that was true, I mean, you follow it through, and you get into some really weird contortions in terms of politics in Canada.
Okay, one more question. Is there one more? Okay, Val.
Yeah, just a quick announcement. Next Thursday is our closing event at the Artesian with Remy Knazi, who's a New York-based spoken word poet and artist. He's going to be having two events. The first is a workshop with any writers, poets, or aspiring poets, which is going to be from 4 until 6, and it's pre-registration only because we have a max of 6. Which is going to be from 4 until 6, and it's pre-registration only because we have a max of 16 people. So if anyone here is interested, just maybe sign up at the back on your way out. And then the main event starts at 8, and it's going to be a performance poetry event. It's free to $20 donation, whatever you feel like contributing. And I hope to see you all there. Oh, and lastly, we have a sign-up sheet for the Regina Solidarity Group, which is organized Israeli Apartheid Week together with Students Against Israeli Apartheid. And if anyone is interested in getting involved, we did pass it around, but if anyone missed it, the sign-up sheet is on the back.
And I want to thank Mike.
Yeah.
Very insightful, lots of food for thought, lots of things to appropriate from you. With permission, I'll ask you afterwards. And thank you, everybody.